What a mess. But I remember when Nathan came home from service, it's interesting that all four of the four boys went to service and I didn't. But when I got in college, the first thing I did was I joined the ROTC. In fact, when Jill saw me in my uniform, she thought I had joined the service. But I remember Nathan, when he came to Chicago once, in fact, he might have moved, at that time he might have been living in Chicago, and he had purchased a Porsche. It was a real neat Porsche. And he came by and showed it to me, let me drive it, show me what it would do. We were going around corners at high speeds and what have you, just admiring how this Porsche handled. And my neighbor, who at that time was a Christian, in fact, he's a very popular Christian now. He's retired now, but he became a very popular pastor in Chicago. And he came out. He played football in Chicago in high school. At this time, he was weighing about, he had to be about 310, 315. And he asked Nathan, "Hey, man, you give me a ride?" We were very close. And so Nathan said, "Yeah." So his name was Oliver, and Oliver got in the car, and it shifted. It just one side went down. And so they pulled off. And I tell you, to see them pulling off with the car leaning one direction was a humorous sight. But Nathan took him around the block there at different speeds. And once he crawled out, he says, "Well, I really enjoyed that. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it." And we duplicated that. Oliver and my brother-in-law and I, Phil, Pat's husband, we bought a boat together. And my next door neighbor wanted to go out in it. So I took him. And he stepped down in the boat, and the boat shifted because of his weight. And I didn't realize I should have told him to sit forward in the center, but he sat on the side. It was all we could do to keep that thing from tipping over. But we finally got it going, and we had a ball with it. But I had to be careful how to turn because the weight difference was probably 100 pounds with him and myself. So those are some of the fond memories I have of some of the things that took place early on. The farm was precious, of course. Enjoyed that, enjoyed going out in the back of the farm and shooting the rifles that they had. I guess they belonged to Winton and Irwin, the 22 rifles that they had. I enjoyed that. It was a nice, feeling doing that, things like that. Nathan, I think we had a ball, and Winton and I had a ball, but not as much because I think it was around that time that Irwin went to the service or went to school. I think it was to service, or one or the other. So the farm was a good place, a good getaway for me. I remember taking my son up, taking Landon up to Michigan. Aunt Jessie said, when he was a youngster, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 years old, because he was crazy about Aunt Jessie. And we left, him there for a week. And before we got on the road good, Aunt Jessie called and said, I don't know how she called us.
She called us when we got home.
We got home.
And he said that he wanted to come home.
He said he wanted to come home. The farm was not for him. So we had to drive back up there and get him and bring him home. I think of that, but he was crazy about Aunt Jessie. And so the remembrances of Aunt Jessie and the farm was preceded, I believe my timeline is right, by the wonderful home they had in Oakwood. It was a little area called Oakwood where the church conference, Lake Region Conference, was located. And they had a beautiful home there. I think it was 3 stories high. It was magnificent. Huge drawing room and things of that nature. I know at one time it was a lot of people living there. Uncle Nebert made a kitchenette out of it. Very interesting people. I remember one time Aunt Jessie was keeping children. Uncle Nebert, of course, always repairing the rooms and painting. And that's something I remember. That's a fond memory I have of Uncle Nebert telling me that it would be okay, because I wanted to be with Irwin, Winton, and myself, painting these kitchenettes. I could still smell it almost, the enamel paint. And I guess that's how I learned how to paint, watching Irwin and watching Winton paint those kitchenettes. And I remember this. It might sound funny, but at the end of the day, I was paid $1. But I'm sure the type of painting I was doing was probably only worth $1 also, because I wouldn't have been anywhere near as good as them. I was very young at the time, but I remember that. And so those were fond memories that I'll always cherish. Looking up to them, just in fact, you didn't have to pay me anything, just being there with them and watching them work and things of that nature. I remember Uncle Nebert as being quiet until he had something to say. I had the privilege of being in Sabbath school when Uncle Nebert came from Hyde Park back to Shiloh. He came to the Sabbath school class that I was in, which at that time was being taught by Abraham Lloyd. And I became the assistant to that, and then I became the teacher for that class. But hearing Uncle Nebert answer questions just spontaneously was awesome. His answers to questions always came with a biblical verification. In other words, this is where you will find that. And so there was never a question about, no one ever questioned his the authoritative response that he gave in Sabbath school. And I listened intently, of course, and learned from that, and always enjoyed that. I enjoyed Uncle Nebert playing the violin in Sabbath school. He was very creative. A lot of people didn't realize that. If you look at some of the things that he did to raise money in Sabbath school, it was unbelievable. The things that he would make graphics, and he would show the progress the church was making with the graphics, like a thermometer, and the people could come in each week and see how much they had raised the week before. He was just tremendous at that. He was a tremendous leadership abilities. So I had the privilege of being in Sabbath school class with Uncle Nebert, and being when Aunt Zilda came here to Chicago, she joined my Sabbath school class, in which I was a teacher, and I had the privilege of being in Sabbath school class with Aunt Zilda. Uncle Clarence also participated in my Sabbath school class. For a short period of time, he rejoined the church. He had left the church and came back to the church. And he immediately took up a ministry of taking senior citizens home after church. I remember Uncle Nebert coming over to the house from time to time, just to see how everybody was doing. And my mother, of course, being the youngest, she would always invite me to stay for dinner, and Uncle Nebert would just stay for dinner. And after dinner, he would sit in one of the easy chairs, and by the time we all finished, Uncle Nebert would sleep. And then my mother would wake him for dessert, and dessert was always ice cream. He loved ice cream. But there's something else that Uncle Nebert did that maybe I don't know if Karen would remember it, Pat would have remembered it, of course. My mother knew. Uncle Nebert loved sports. Uncle Nebert would come to I played high school in public school. On 2 or 3 occasions, it might have been 3 occasions, Uncle Nebert showed up at my basketball games to watch me play. Whenever he had an opportunity to show up at the games at church, he would come. And he would laugh after the game and, give me comments of encouragement and stuff like that. He enjoyed basketball. And so I was always, glad about that. I'm thinking now of, because I mentioned Uncle Clarence. Uncle Clarence was a little different than Uncle Nebert and my mother and Aunt Zilda. Uncle Clarence was more worldly, but he was, how can I say it? He was the most thoughtful person you could ever want to know. Always wanting to know how you're doing. I remember when I began to understand Uncle Clarence, because I couldn't quite understand why all the other siblings were Christians and he wasn't. Not to say he wasn't a Christian, but he wasn't an Adventist. But his vocation was in the pressing. He was a tremendous presser of clothes. He also worked on a railroad. And he worked at one of the most prestigious hotels in Chicago at the time. So he came in contact with a lot of famous people. I remember one day he brought over a pair of shoes that Dave Garraway had given him after he had played golf in them. And he'd only wore them one time. And he asked Clarence, do you want them? He says, well, I'll give them to my nephew. He's a tall fellow, he'll probably fit him. Dave Garraway at that time, one of the most popular personalities on radio and then later on television at that time. So he knew people like that. He would give us things, sweaters and things like that from people. They would give it to him. But he was an awesome presser of clothes and became very prominent downtown. He could get a job anywhere. And so he made an exorbitant amount of money. And when I say that, I'm not kidding. You'd see his apartment that he had. It was lavish. White carpeting. Well, when he got married to his first wife, whose name was Dorothy, and when he got married to her, their apartment was just lavish and everything. His clothes, he had the best of clothes. He shopped at the best of places. When my father was paying $1 for our ties, I think Uncle Clarence was paying 25 for his ties. But that's the way. He wasn't a show-off at all. I remember when he got his first new car, he came by the house one night. He knew I loved cars. And it was a 1953 Oldsmobile, Super 98 Oldsmobile. Green bottom, white top. And it was air conditioned. This was one of the first air conditioning cars that was ever manufactured. It had plastic tubes in the back to send the air back there. And when my father saw it, he said, "Clarence, you didn't spend that kind of money on a car, did you?" And Clarence said, "Well, yeah, come on, let's go for a ride." And again, the statement that my father was making, you have to remember where my father came from. He never would be hungry again. So my father would spend a penny, but he would save a penny. My father in his lifetime never owed anybody. The only note my father ever made was for the house that he purchased. Every car he purchased cash. Everything he bought, he purchased cash. A lot of the things I didn't understand as a young person. When my father bought my first bike, it was a J.C. Higgins bike. The best bikes in those days that everybody loved were the Schwinn and the Roadmaster. But mine was a J.C. Higgins bike. And when I got my first train my father purchased, it was I'm trying to think, American Flyer, which was more real than the other train, which was at that time was a Lionel train. The Lionel train had 3 tracks. But what railroad runs on 3 tracks? They run on 2 tracks. So the American Flyer was the most authentic. But it was cheaper than a Lionel, but not as popular. But my father was always thinking, I'm not going to make a bill for anything. And he always taught us if you have to make a bill for it, you can't afford it. So let's buy it secondhand. My father made a suit on a sewing machine. And our family, everybody who saw it couldn't believe that he made that suit. But we saw him sew that suit over a period of a week or so. He figured if he saw it, he could make it. But getting back to Uncle Clarence, so we got in the car, and Uncle Clarence says, "Ronnie, you want to sit up front?" And I did. And I tell you, it was just amazing how smooth that car was. And then he turned on the air conditioning, and couldn't get it to work. And so my father said, "Here, let's do this." And so my father had to show my uncle how to work the air conditioning. But it was just tremendous how Uncle Clarence thought Ronnie would love to see this car and ride in this car. And we were the first ones to ride in that car. And he would do things like that. He would take us, Winton and I both, he would take us to the ballpark, to games. And I can't think of how many things he would do for us. And but he was always there. Whatever it was, he wanted it, he would get it. And I always admired him for that. He and Aunt Dorothy didn't make it as far as husband and wife is concerned. They got a divorce. And soon after, Uncle Clarence fell on hard times. So my father offered the apartment in the lower level, which would have been the basement area, which my father had fixed up into a nice apartment. Uncle Clarence lived down there. And it was just amazing, the fun that we had. And just amazing. And then, of course, he was able to start getting a better job in the industry, someone who had remembered how good he was, and that he met Aunt Ola. He loved to play bridge, cards. She loved to too. They had a group that would meet every week, and that's how he met Aunt Ola. Fell in love, and they got married. And of course, they stayed together until Uncle Clarence passed away. But Uncle Clarence, about 10 years, I want to say, before he passed, came back to the church uh, through encouragement from my mother and from the family and from us. Especially as we started to get older, he felt that he didn't want to discourage us from staying in the church. And he was rebaptized and became a faithful member in the church. He loved the church. And he loved, for some reason, the older folk, and would take them home every Sabbath in his car. If he couldn't get them all in, he would take them home and then come back and get the others. And so he was very viable in influencing us. He's a wonderful uncle. And I guess there's the one uncle that I never met. And that was Uncle Gladstone. Uncle Gladstone would have been the next sibling to my mother. From what I understand, he was born in Barbados. But as a teenager, he became ill and he passed away. But all the stories of Gladstone is that he was the intelligent one. Now remember, they're coming from Barbados. They were intelligent, period. Aunt Zilda, Uncle Nebert, Uncle Clarence. The educational system over there was par excellence. And but of all of them, I'm told that he was the one who was just a master at the King's English. In school, his grades were just excellent, and just a great person. Of course, he died before we had ever had a chance to meet him. Aunt Zilda was, of course, the only aunt I had on my mother's side, and she was a Christian, of course. She always sent us things from New York or wherever she was working. She was a Bible worker. And from time to time, people would transfer from New York or up in Eastern Conference and come to Chicago and become a part of our church. And when they found out that she was our aunt, they would always say, "Oh, the marvelous Bible worker. She is just par excellence." And of course, these were just words. We heard them from pastors. We heard them from friends and what have you. But we really didn't understand to what extent until she actually came to Chicago. Her reason to coming to Chicago was she wanted to retire, but from the professional side of it, but she never retired. And she wanted to spend more time with her relatives. And so she called, and of course by this time Joe and I were married. We were raising a family. And she says, "Ronald, do you think you all could come up?" She says, "You're going to give me a grand going away. And we're going to a party, so we'd like for you to come up so you could be a part of that." And of course, this is understanding now. When Aunt Zilda came to visit, she would always take part in the programs that we had at Shiloh, marching and all that. So we knew she knew how to march. Like if she was a dancer, she would have been a dancer par excellence. She knew how to march. She knew how to get people to march. She knew how to get people engaged. But anyway, so this was a sit-down dinner. It was wonderful. Just accolades from pastors and teachers and administrators telling how she's going to be missed and what a great job she did in the Eastern Conference. And so the next morning we were to come to Chicago. And Joe, of course, would drive our car, and we loaded it down, and we loaded down Aunt Zilda's car. I mean, I was to drive our car, of course. Aunt Zilda was going to drive her car. As we began the journey, I think we were about 10 miles away from her apartment. And she pulled over. And I have to admit, I'm the most impatient person on the road. I like to get on the road and let's go. And she pulled over and she said, I said, "Is everything all right?" And I think Lori, I think, was riding in the car with Aunt Zilda. And I said, "Is everything all right?" She said, "Oh, yeah, nothing wrong with the car or anything." She said, "But I just want to rest a little bit." And I said, "Huh?" She said, "It's going to be a long drive. Maybe we could just rest just a little bit." And it was all I could do except say, "What are you talking about? We're 900 miles from home, from Chicago." And so I said, "Okay." So I went back to tell Joe. And so we said, "Well, obviously that's not going to work. We don't know how many rest stops she's going to want to make. We want to get there before next week." So I said, well, Aunt Zilda, I'll drive your car, and Joe will drive our car. And we'll just go on, and if Joe gets tired, then we'll switch up. So she said, oh, that's a good idea. Well, obviously, we drove all the way. And so we laughed about it later, of course. But that's how the move from New York to Chicago took place. And of course, she stayed in the apartment upstairs, the third floor apartment, the second floor apartment. We couldn't have had a more wonderful time with Aunt Zilda because right away when she introduced to the church, she became the pianist. She became the Bible worker. She was bringing in more people than the Bible worker was, just freelancing. She did programs there that they had never heard of before. We did one program, Aunt Zilda did. She got three churches together to cooperate, called the Children of the World. You would not believe the attendance. The church was packed, hundreds of people, to see that program. And it raised a lot of money for a coronation, that we were doing as a family. Lori was about to graduate from high school. All the girls in the church were part of a coronation. And the idea was to raise the most money that would be the queen. And we just got our family together, of course, and with Aunt Zilda's ideas and our ideas and people that I worked with, people that worked for me, it was just a piece of cake. But Aunt Zilda got it and said, well, let's make a program out of this too. And all of our friends at the church and at the other churches joined in. We had 2 choirs come over from other churches to sing in the program. And we had raised a lot of money from that. And of course, the night of the coronation, everybody as we were coming in said, you guys got it hands down. It's just unbelievable. But in the enthusiasm from it, Aunt Zilda had a ball doing that. And she started a class. And a lot of people graduated from the class and were baptized and are still in the church today. I can't tell you how many people Aunt Zilda brought into the church that were baptized and are still in the church after she had retired. And the socials were just unbelievable. She would take part in it. Of course, we were developed the socials, and the kids would come out and do whatever we were doing. And then Aunt Zilda would go by and get the older folk. Come on, and they wouldn't move until they saw her. And she would say, if I can do it, you can do it. And she was always in the middle of everything, never being a nuisance, but always being a participant. And she was just something else. But the consummate Christian. I was telling Winton that when I went to check on her, we realized something must be wrong because she hadn't answered her phone. When I got into her apartment, the radio was going, it was tuned to Moody. And when I went in her study, she was slumped over. It was obvious that she had passed. And she had her Sabbath school lesson opened to the lesson and the Bible there in her lap. I wonder how many of us could say that if we passed away doing something, whatever it is, we want everybody to know what we were doing. Whether it was looking at a movie we shouldn't be looking at, was eating something we shouldn't be eating, a television program, a radio program, or whatever. But Aunt Zilda was who she represented, a child of God. And of course, I was very hurt to think that she died like that. We always check, we always call back and forth every day virtually. The most would be 2 days. But we always did everything together. But that happened, and she was just very precious to us as an aunt. I will share a story real quickly that always makes us laugh. She wanted to take the kids to the Museum of Science and Industry. So of course we said, okay, sure. So everybody got in the car. And so she had the kids, which she just adored. And she pulled out from the house, which is 63rd and Racine at this time, 64th and Racine. And she's going a distance of about 4.5, maybe 6 miles, I would say, at the most. And she pulled off and went on. We said goodbye, be careful, and what have you. And she was getting up in ages at this point, but she was still driving, pretty good. But when they got back, the kids, I said, well, how do things go? She said, oh, everybody told me they had a lot of fun. But then one of the children said, "Mommy, Daddy, we only got about to Halsted in Aunt Zilda. About Halsted, I think.
They had left the museum in just a short span.
Distance,
So they had to
yeah.
pull over and pick it up.
Traveled about 5 blocks. And she pulled over and said she needed to rest. And so the kids was looking and saying, "Oh." So she said they just sat there while Aunt Zilda took a nap. And then she pulled off again and went as far as she could. But it was just humorous, those things they would look back at and laugh about. But how important it was for her to take the children to the museum and appreciate that time with them, of course. And she did other things, of course, with them through the years. But she was very, very precious to us.